I'm Ruth Martin. I'm the Deputy Field Director at People for the American Way. I think the grassroots are the people part of any kind of people-powered campaign. They're the base, they're the activists, they're the energy, they're your biggest tool in getting anything done. They're the voice and the energy and the action that you need to harness to move any campaign forward. Volunteers are absolutely critical. They're the only way your campaign is going to be a success. You'll never have enough time, money, staff to run any kind of a campaign without having your volunteers. They are the power behind a campaign. And it's power you have to harness and train and use effectively, and that in itself can be a challenge, but they are absolutely critical to any kind of a grassroots campaign. They're your door knockers, they're your organizers that you're not paying with anything probably more than a t-shirt and pizza. They're also kind of a good focus group, although they're probably going to agree with you. They're a good group to test messages on, and they can also give you kind of a sense of what's happening in the community. It's kind of a good barometer in a lot of ways. I have gotten a lot of really good advice over the last several years with really expert organizers, but there was one thing that really stood out for me at a training that I went to before I'd really gotten involved in too much, which is you really have to keep things in perspective. You have to remember that there is life outside of the campaign. When you're committed to the issue or the candidate, you become consumed by the campaign. And you can totally lose perspective. You eat, sleep, breathe, drink, dream the campaign, but not everybody else does that, and the voters aren't doing that. So I think it's critically important that you keep that in mind. And what this organizer said at this training was to keep a picture on your cubicle of the person or the reason that you're actually going home at night and the reason that you're there. The hours get long, and it can be really frustrating when you're overwhelmed with this issue and it feels like nobody else really gets it. But it's important that voters are able to relate to you, and they're not going to be able to relate to a martyr. So you kind of have to keep it in perspective, try to keep it in perspective, and try to know too that at some point this campaign is going to be over, and you don't want to be friendless when it's over. So it's a good idea to try to have some balance. It's easier said than done, I think, but try. Actually, last year I was working on a campaign in Ohio in 2005, and it was the field coordinator there, the voter outreach coordinator. They didn't have a lot of money for their field campaign, and they didn't have a lot of room, so they were running their phone banks actually out of people's individual homes. They kept giving volunteers lists of their neighbors that had been ID'd as positive on the issue, and had them calling their neighbors. And I was very skeptical that this was going to work because there wasn't a lot of quality control. It was very different than what I was used to seeing, lots of volunteers at a phone bank, and you can walk around, you can see how the calls are going and get instant feedback, which is so important when you're running a campaign. And so I didn't think that this would work, but amazingly, they had a lot of success. And I think that what that shows is there are a lot of new technologies to use, but low tech still has its place in a campaign, especially when you're tight on the funds. And I think the other thing that showed was that people show something that we already know, which is one-on-one contact is the best way to get your message across to your audience. And having neighbors call neighbors actually ended up working. I don't know if that would really work on a larger scale or that you would even want to do that. But for small campaigns, it really worked. And I think it's getting back to basics. Having block captains walking up and down your block, IDing your own voters, your own neighbors. I think that's something that we need to turn to as a progressive movement, to kind of look back at some of the more tried and true methods and supplement those certainly with the newer technologies, which make our lives easier. But that was just kind of an interesting observation from Ohio in '05. This is really more for the organizers that are sending these people out, but I cannot stress this enough. You have to know the lit. You've got to do the training where you do the one-on-one role play and go over the lit. This is especially critical when you're working on a nonpartisan campaign, which we have done a lot of at People for the American Way Foundation. You've got to make sure people are going to stay on message. And inevitably, they're going to trail off somewhere, so the more emphasis you can put on going over the lit and the message time and time and time again before you send them out, the better off you are. We would actually have people stand in front of a room of our volunteers, and when our foundation was working on the election protection project, it was complicated. Some of it was complicated. So we'd go over the Voters' Bill of Rights, right by right by right, and ask if people had questions and really spend some time on that. Don't just send people out the door because you're in a hurry to get them out in the field. It won't be effective if they're going off message. So for the volunteer that shows up and you're doing it, I mean, it's critical. These messages have been tested. The people running the campaign they know what works. So don't deviate from that. As much as possible from the core message. I think it's very important. I think one of the biggest challenges is time, especially when you're trying to recruit volunteers. People don't have a lot of time. They're very selfish with their time, and rightfully so. People are very busy. They have families. They have other obligations. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is getting the volunteers, the grassroots, even if they're not showing up to your office to do your lit drop or help you with your mailing, just to even get them to take the time to make the phone call to the representative, or just to do that that little bit of action. It's time, and it's also making the connection and making the activists, the grassroots, the volunteers, making that connection of why your issue should be their issue. It's time consuming. I really think it's time. I don't think you'll win without it. So you have to have them. People for the American Way just was part of a major campaign around the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, we didn't get the outcome that we would have hoped with that, but there's no way we would even have come as close as we did if we weren't getting people to take action. You just can't win if you're not leveraging your volunteers and your grassroots. It's actually something that's very dear to me. It's very cliche, but you're only going to be as strong as your weakest link. And the more time, the more autonomy and leadership that people have over their own projects, the more invested they're going to be in their work, and the more committed they're going to be to the organization or the campaign. And people need to feel like what they do matters and that their contributions are valued. And that builds leadership. So the more of the work that you can spread around, the more you trust the staff you have, the volunteers that are there, because they've been empowered to do the job you've assigned them to do. They have some control over it. The better off your overall campaign or organization is going to be. And that takes some time, and it takes a lot of trust to delegate that kind of authority to people, but it is infinitely worth it. It just creates a much better community, and it gets the job done, and it really creates a much stronger teamwork in an organization. I think the best thing you can do, I think people know the answer to what they need to do, and I think the best thing that you can do as an organizer or a manager is to ask the person that you've just tasked with a project, when they come to you and say, what do I do next, or how do I do this, ask them what they think, because they probably know, and they may have thought of something differently than you have, but you can start the conversation that way. I think that's the best thing you can do, is ask them, what do you think? How would you do this? And then if you don't get the answer you want or that you think works, you kind of talk through that and have that conversation, but it's about conversations, and I really think that's the best thing you can do. I was joking around with somebody the other day, but I think, leadership is not, it's not usually something that's just handed to you. And I think a lot of people that end up in leadership positions didn't always think that that's where they would be either. And I think that you recognize that something needs to be done and that nobody else is doing it, so you step up and you get it done. If not you, then who? And you may not know the best way to get it done, which is something I've had to learn myself, but that you're willing to do it, that you're willing to figure out the best way, and you're willing to take the responsibility for making sure that it happens is I think what ends up making you a leader. The other thing I think is she who calls the meetings ends up being in charge. So it's, I think it's a good organizing tool if you see something going on that you think you could do better, and you are not quite sure how to get in there. Call the meeting, organize the meeting, facilitate the meeting, make the meeting happen, do the follow-up, you end up being in charge.